So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this beautiful venue for our cool conversation on a hot topic, art and class. As Freddie said, my name's Brenda Emmanus, and I'm delighted to be here with you all today. Now, art and class, it's a conversation about class, that quiet architect of our opportunities that shapes who moves through the doors and culture, who gets to speak on the stages, and who gets left in the wings. Class isn't just about money, though. It's about confidence and networks and expectation, that subtle inheritance of what feels possible. In the arts, we talk a lot about talent and passion being enough, but we know that for some, the climb is much steeper before they even get to perform. So tonight we ask, how does class shape who gets to create, who gets to stay, and who gets to be celebrated? And more importantly, how do we make the arts more porous, more daringly open, and more real? But as we say, we have an amazing panelist, and we don't want to be all Eeyore and not Winnie the Pooh. We are going to celebrate the great people and the great things that have been done in the arts despite the challenges. So allow me to introduce you to our brilliant panelist, Laura Griffiths, who's a researcher, educator, and co-host of Dancing Class, Exploring Dance, Identity and Access. Rachel Krische, a performer, academic, and co-creator of Dancing Class, whose work bridges practice and research. Neil Griffiths, founder and CEO of Arts Emergency, championing young people from underrepresented backgrounds in the creative industries. And Sahra Warsame, theatre maker, producer, and curator, working across community, experimental, and institutional spaces. Let's make them feel welcome with a warm. Right then, people, let's start with some hard facts. Fewer than 1 in 10 people working in the arts today comes from the working class backgrounds. Access to arts education in the UK schools have fallen by almost half over the past decade, and in the most deprived areas, students are far less likely to even have the option to study dance, drama, or art. That sounds really grim from an old person like me who just loves the arts. And it is. So when I sort of wrote to you and say, class shapes opportunity in the arts, what's your response and why? No rush.
All right, I've got the mic, I was poised. I think, Brenda, that class itself is a matter of culture, and we can't separate class and notions of class from culture itself. I think the shaping of opportunity in the arts is it's complex because often we're trapped within hierarchies that are beyond the control of the individual, or the systems in place that maybe reinforce kind of perceptions of binaries or boundaries that are placed around who gets to access what and how and where. I think part of what I think of when I think about kind of shaping opportunity and barriers is representation, and who do we see and where do we see them and what does that represent. Sorry, I'm saying lots of things, but also I think often what we think about is we can think about underrepresentation and marginalisation, and we often think about notions of kind of race, of age, of gender, but we often forget, or it's easy to overlook the fact that those things are all intersectional with class and representations of class. And I guess what I'm getting at is that class is always attached to artistic practice in some way, shape or form, and perhaps it's just some notions of expressions of class that have been prioritised or privileged historically, that also kind of perpetuate a system of what we see, or what is maybe supported more through financial models that dictates the way that class is represented in artistic practice.
So let me throw the tennis ball across the pitch. And to you, because when I remember about COVID and that whole period, everyone was creating, everyone was finding a way to be creative, whether they were dancing or going to the park and taking photographs, which is what I did, or baking banana bread or whatever. We all were indulging in the arts in some way or form, it felt like. So it felt like you could do arts anywhere. When we're talking about arts and class, are we talking about the privilege of having it as an opportunity, as a career, as a vision? Define what it means to you.
Well, I was going to say, like, culture, it's a social issue. So I agree that you can't separate someone's identity and community from culture. We're kind of talking about a narrow definition of culture, I struggle to know what to call it. Mainstream culture, I guess, kind of sums it up. And I think that the issues that people face are material social issues. It's issues of housing. If you don't live in London, you've got way less opportunities to contribute to culture in a way for which you are paid. And if you want to contribute to culture, it's very hard to find reliable salary jobs in those industries. I mean, there are 3 million paid jobs in the cultural and creative industries. So it's not that they don't exist, but it's also a social issue in that the people that gatekeep, or like the bosses in those paid jobs, if you want to sort of narrow it down to that, their professional and social networks are closed. And it's not criticism, it's just a fact, in the same way that mine growing up on a South London council estate, my professional and social networks were closed, but that means that the opportunities kind of siphon around the same kind of small friends of friends or kids of friends, and that really narrows who's even getting to the front door in terms of making their way and making a sustainable life, I should say, in culture. That's a very different thing to being someone that has talent and potential and passion for creating culture. You can still do that, but to do it in a way that is recognised and sustainable materially, that is a function of privilege.
Let me propagate a little bit, because I'm the first job I'm really passionate about that I wanted to go for, and it was in the creative industries. But I didn't, part because when I looked and saw who was doing those jobs, it was predominantly white Oxbridge men, and I thought, I'm never going to get this. And when I applied for the job, I didn't even tell anybody that I was going for it. I thought, well, I'm going to get rejected anyway, so why bother? But I got in. I did get it, and have had an amazing career, and it hasn't been without resistance. It hasn't been without all the isms. It hasn't been without challenge, and I've had to work really hard and navigate it. So I just want to talk about the invisible barriers. Do you think the fact that sometimes we feel shut out means we shut ourselves out, or do you think we should be kicking down doors? Or reality is we are kept out? There are ways that
there are structural issues that do keep the majority of people from pursuing these. But in terms of the way you might see it from the other side, definitely there's issues of taste. So that narrow sort of layer of people that do produce culture have a certain set of tastes that if you want to get into a paid job in those industries, you have to learn those tastes and learn that language, really. So there are those issues. I go back again to like sustainable paid work is a real issue. I couldn't even study English literature at uni. I was the first person to go because my dad was like, you can only do law. You can only do law because that will lead to a job. And that is still an issue that young people in our community still face from their parents. It's not, it's no one's fault, but they're not massively wrong either in that it looks a lot more profitable to go and study law. It's probably not a great idea in the current climate. But, you know, like there are lots of things. You wouldn't find it as exciting
either, would you?
No, it's not as exciting. But you can do a conversion, do an arts degree and then convert. That's what we always say.
Let me ask you a bit more about your specific jobs. Laura, for example, your work brings together dance practice, archives, and embodied memory. How does your interest in archival practice intersect with questions of class and visibility, and whose history gets recorded and preserved?
Yeah. Great, thank you. Lots to unpack. Okay, let's start at the top. So I think certainly thinking about dance and archives to start with. Dance and archival practice, that's where my PhD research was located, and the interesting thing about that is, of course, dance struggles to accommodate, the archive struggles to accommodate dance because it's lived, it's transient, it's ephemeral. So there's that sort of issue to contend with, but also the other dimension of that, certainly working with archives over time in dance, is that you rarely encounter the voice of the dancer or the practitioner, or that you cannot access the lived experience of the person doing the dance. And also, it's very uncommon to access materials where the voice of the dancer or the practitioner is shared. So certainly part of the Dancing Class podcast, sorry, I did that thing with my voice. Part of the work that we're doing on the Dancing Class podcast is to address that gap in knowledge and information. But of course, that is kind of twofold in relation to the fact that we are deliberately inviting people who identify as being from working class backgrounds, who have pursued a career in the arts and in dance specifically in many different ways, as a vehicle through which the visibility of experience in dance and navigating a career in dance can be archived in a particular way. The way we're working with technology as well is so that we can, we're doing kind of talking dancing, we're calling it. So we're actually, with some of our guests, we're moving in space and recording the dialogue as we speak, which is particularly strategic in thinking about the kind of proximity to the practice in our conversations and how that facilitates the unlocking of memory, which also relates to the archival context of kind of how you can be close to the practice, and actually that often, and this is something that both Rachel and I have researched, that often brings back a kind of more, a closer knowledge or a more embodied kind of intense sensorial knowledge of the past through moving in space.
Yeah. Let's bring in your podcasting crime and
partnering crime.
I mean, it's very interesting because I think when you've spent the majority of your practice is embodied and moving, of course there's talking in the studio, there's a hell of a lot of talking, but the finished article is often predominantly communicated with the body in space. And I think there's a lot of memory that is kind of really unlocked by just shifting and moving around. A lot of dancers are just real wrigglers. They like have ants in their pants, and it's very
She's
hard.
She's proving that point now.
Right now for me to sit still. But and so we wanted to. I sense that some people might recall things or remember things differently if they weren't sitting at a desk with a microphone. And I think sometimes that does happen in some of our podcast interviews. And sometimes what is surprising is that how people recount memories that might be 30 years old, but they brought just the recalling of that for themselves brings them to tears almost slightly, because they've forgotten about that. Well, they've never forgotten, but they suddenly bring from the past right the way forward that person who told them, you can dance. And it was a pivot point in their lives that sent them on a completely different journey. And for most people who've talked about that, a journey that was far more positive than the track they were on at that point in their young lives. And that's really moving to be in the space when that happens as well with people.
And also, sorry, just to add, thinking about archives in particular, that of course we're talking about dance experiences and dance careers, but also what we're in doing that, we're also revealing or opening up dialogue around working class tradition and critical dialogue around that with our guests, and also making visible the different routes into dance careers that perhaps look very different for people in a current context, that emerging from a dance education in the 1980s looked very different to how it looks now. And so actually what we're revealing is beyond the kind of scope of dance, but also people's, thinking about Neil's point earlier, thinking about like the social experience of people. We've had guests like Gary Clark who are talking about being within a mining town in South Yorkshire and
baton twirling.
Yeah, baton twirling and going to miners' galas, and that's what shaped his first dance experiences. And I think that's probably quite common for a lot of people in that era or generation, but perhaps that's just something we don't really know about.
Refreshing narratives to hear as well.
Yeah.
Let's move beyond dance for a bit and turn to Sahra. As an artist, producer and curator working across margins and mainstreams, I wondered what your experience has been in terms of working with institutions and then bringing your own visions of wanting to bring out the different communities and radical belonging into the house, as it were.
That's a good question. I like loud people in quiet institutions. Like, I just love the idea of bringing people who discouraged from being in spaces and like inviting them in and letting them make noise, letting them take up physical space. I think that's very important. And I think that can open so much doors to physically sort of seeing yourself in a space and imagining yourself there. and contributing to like a cultural moment inside an institution is very important. I'm also like really interested in communities that might not know or might not consider themselves as artists, and are not really considered as artists in sort of like the Western sense. So earlier this year I got to work with refugee chefs, and that was great, and we got to sort of explore mediums of sound and taste, and just sort of bring that creativity to, or invite different demographics into institutions to bring that creativity, and sort of experience that in a way that they may have not before. Yeah.
And what has been the outcome of that for you? What have you found?
I think it's been great to sort of foster like relationships between communities. I think what happens in London with working class communities in particular is that we spend years walking past institutions and we never spend time inside them. And it was always like sort of daunting to be in the space. So allowing people in a sort of safe, relaxed environment to come in and to be invited to have sort of a stake and a say has sort of helped bridge that sort of community gap, which has been great, yeah.
Let me come back to you, Neil. Often allowing access or bringing access means some kind of a scheme or project or initiative. And when we talk about access, do you think sometimes it can sound like, I guess, a bit like Oliver the begging bowl, please, sir, can I have some more?
Yeah.
Do you think we need to reframe it? It needs to be reframed?
I always say about Arts Emergency, like we're a charity for financial reasons. It's great financially, but we're not a charity in what we do. Because allowing people to contribute to their culture, and Sahra and I were talking backstage about institutional working, we don't work with institutions directly. We've got 20,000 people in a network that represent a vast array of institutions, and through mentoring individual young people, their first introduction to those institutions will be for a trusted person, and it will be a safer space for them, because that sense of belonging and leads to agency and leads to a sense of ownership over those institutions. But it's long, long work. It's long, long work, and I think particularly for cultural industries, they're not really like industries, they are communities and networks. Like they are just, think about film and festivals, they're like small enterprises that balloon around activity and pull lots of people in. So I think like the question of how you work with institutions in this space is quite complicated, and our answer to that is kind of like yours, but in an individuated way with a trusted person. And that's your way into understanding this institution and various others. The sort of atomization of charity schemes, very good in some ways, but also quite divisive, I think, when you think about this as an intersectional issue, and we're in a moment right now where intersectional solidarity and mutual care is incredibly important. Sometimes those programs can be counterproductive in the sense of, some people will get aid and some people won't in terms of accessing. So yeah, I think like community and building community and deepening relationships and building trust is the way you approach these big, complicated, systemic problems. We haven't finished it yet. We've only been doing it for 15 years, but we see impact. There's a big difference between one young person on an access program and what we've built, which is 2,500 young people in a community, all of whom are connected to each other in some way. So when they're going in, they're not actually going in alone, and sometimes that is the case. I think if you come from a marginalised background, so you're lower socioeconomic group, global majority, or disability especially, you're quite often singled out in those. A lot of the testimony from other allies and friends speaks to that as well. So yeah, the community, for me, feels like a really important thing.
Are there some areas that are more challenging than others still?
Do you mean like industries?
Yeah. Without naming, of course.
They're all challenging. Like they are all challenging because they've been decimated by funding and a literal plague and all of it, right? So they're all difficult, and there's a real variation across them. So like publishing has really great data on why they're problematic, whereas like film and TV have loads of educational institutions that sprung up to kind of access apprenticeship levies, but they haven't got great data. They've only just started to capture like economic data on people in the industry. So it's really spiky. And I think like the main, like running Arts Emergency, we kind of sit across all these industries. So the main things that we think of when we think of the challenges across holistically, it's the same kinds of people running all these institutions and industries, and that's not an attack, right? It's just social structures that have led to that being the case, so we're all going to change it peacefully. But they mistake
Is that
structure.
peacefully in brackets?
Yeah, very peacefully. But like they mistake structural advantage for meritocracy. And like I said, they have smaller networks. So they're not, like if you work in a factory, for example, you're not going to know a university lecturer. And if you're working in publishing, you're probably not going to know someone that's working as a taxi driver. And so there's distinct worlds. So that's a real challenge. And I think that you come back to things like unpaid internships, which even now are kind of a norm. And a lot of people that are in charge of institutions kind of think, well, I had to do it, so you have to do it too.
Think of all
But
that
they didn't
experience you're getting.
I know, but they didn't have to do it because they had the dole and they had social housing and a welfare state. You know, so there's a real this is a through line across every industry that we connect with, and that's everything from academia through to dance, through to you name it. Like anything a young person's interested in, we have accrued volunteers in those spaces. So it's quite a good cross section.
So without kicking the door down and doing it peacefully, as you say, what would work? What radical things? I mean, we've seen blind auditions. I don't know. And that's got you in the door doesn't mean that once you're in, there's the retention and there's the experience and there's a whole load of other things that go on there. For example, if funding bodies require that 50% of grants must come from low income or disadvantaged background, do you think that would change the landscape? Do you think that would work, or would that cause more resentment and more problems?
It's just my take.
We'd like your take.
Ireland has just introduced an artist's basic income this week. It's 325 euros a week. You can apply for it. You just have to show that you have some form of practice. You've done it, or you're doing it, or the education. So that would help.
They finished a pilot study of it, which was really successful.
Yeah, they did a 3-year study on this, and it was like 1.46. Every euro invested, 46, was it cents? This cents. Came back, one euro and 46 cents came back. So even if you're an economist, it made sense. So looking at that, I can't tell you how many older artists across all the different practices talk about the dole as something that was relied on to get in. Even I am a generation that only paid $3,000 a year for tuition, university tuition only. Do you know what I mean? I only paid it off a year ago.
Them days.
Yeah, but like, so artist basic income, or bring back the welfare state, healthcare, housing, they're important things to people from working class backgrounds. They matter in a way that I think the gatekeepers that run the industries don't necessarily understand or give enough value to.
I think just to add into that picture, because we're speaking of particularly at a point from 18 years plus or something, but I think for me, I feel, and it's not a radical suggestion at all, but it's to bring back arts in schools. The downgrading of art subjects at e-baccalaureate was the first nail in the coffin. And if your only experience of art, my experience of art was at school. As at primary school, I did clog dancing and folk dance. And I happened to, in my local community, my father's Slovenian, I used to do Yugoslav folk dance, so in those sort of different cultural communities of where I grew up as well. But I did GCSE dance at school, and without that, I always wanted to go to dance lessons, but I knew my parents couldn't afford to send me to dance lessons. But I knew that was how I accessed art and dance. And I think if you're a young person who hasn't studied any art practice at school, why on earth would you get in debt for £50,000 when to try out something you've never even experienced before? But also, I think whether or not you pursue then an art degree once you leave school, the benefit of art subjects in school is huge in how it impacts your ability to learn, to be creative thinkers, to have empathy, to collaborate, to be there's sometimes I feel like education gets really compartmentalized into subjects, when actually we need to be thinking much more holistically about how we learn and how we develop, much more broadly than, passing an exam at a certain level in a certain subject.
It feels like in this climate, the only way that's going to happen is if you get government involved and the Treasury involved and people that can make the difference, value arts and culture for what it was, almost see it. And I suppose I can say, and I know the Mayor's Cultural Leadership Board have been discussing this about how you make creative industry be seen in the same way you as a part of the infrastructure, the same way you see the NHS, in the same way you see transport, and be a testament for its social value, its impact, its well-being. Unless that happens, I don't think we're going to get in a position where we'll see the value of arts education back where it should be.
100%. It's not rocket science. Universities should be free. People should be able to have a broad and comprehensive education from the age of 5 onwards. Well, that's too early, actually, but, from whenever. And people should, being creative and being paid for being creative should not be a function of privilege. And it's a function of privilege even to be able to imagine different ways of living. This is stuff, it's so basic. I'm not an artist. I came into this as an activist years ago now, and it's so obvious, these answers. And I think the question is, where is the will? Why aren't we doing these obvious things that, even on the economic basis, show that they are, economically productive in extremis for the UK? So, I've never figured it out, but I feel like there's quite obvious answers, and they are questions for government.
But that's like pushing water uphill at present when we look at what priorities are. And one of the things I enjoy about working, mentoring and talking to young people is that they're impatient and they ain't waiting for nobody. They just get, for want of a better word, sugar done. All right? And if we were to take that approach and not wait because we will be waiting forever, what could we, people in positions now, or people that have some kind of sphere of influence, what could we do on a practical level to kind of shift the dial a little bit from the spheres of influence and the privilege that we ourselves have? Because if we're going to wait on them, we're going to be waiting a long time. Sahra, what would you, for example, what would you like to see? If you were in charge tomorrow, we're making you Minister of Culture. Go on, why not? I like your jumper.
Dream. Oh, thank you. First of all, everybody has to wear the same colours as me. No.
I'll go for that. Red and white Arsenal colours, why not?
I think it's very important, especially with the tastemakers, to reflect the diversity of the country and I'm just going to say the city in particular, because when that happens, you're going to see art and you're going to see potential in a lot of people in a way you haven't before. And the people who do have the sort of say in culture at the moment are all reading the same books, and they all have the same canon, and they have the same points of reference. And if we sort of rely on them, we're just going to be watching and reading and listening to the same things over and again. So yeah, I think if I had a dictatorship, everyone, hypothetically speaking, everyone would it'd be very diverse, and I'd make sure that the output is reflected in that, and not in sort of a tokenistic way, in a way that what happens with institutions is that the people that work there do not reflect the sort of one-off work that's coming in and out of the building, and that's sort of their way of sort of interacting with minorities and artists and working class artists and sort of keeping them at an arm's length without actually having a say in what goes on in the building. So I think that, but on a national scale, my dictatorship. Yeah.
Okay, long live your dictatorship, man.
We're all behind you.
But are there any glimmers of hope? Have you, from your own experiences, thought, oh my God, this is really the way forward, what we're doing here is really working? In dance, for example. You're looking at each other with such...
It just feels the
wearisome.
kind of, I think that the conversations that we're having in different contexts, in educational contexts, in kind of industry-based, and they're not always separate, but it just, particularly in dance, it feels that the battles are really strong at the moment. And I think there was a glimmer of hope recently that some statistical data from One Dance UK that GCSE dance uptake has increased in this past year, which is great, because I think, coming back to your previous question, I think it's really this idea that actually access to arts in an educational context is a way that most young people are going to be able to encounter arts. if they don't have the opportunity to encounter that otherwise. So I think for me it always comes back to that, what can education do better to support artistic engagement, and to support a kind of diverse citizenship in young people going forwards in their lives. But yeah, it's difficult. I think the conversations are difficult, particularly in the dance context. But just coming back a little bit as well, what's been really fantastic in the podcast series we're doing is there's some really brilliant examples of where people have kind of been very clear and considered in actually how they want to demonstrate their class heritage. They want to demonstrate their working class liveness when they enter into spaces. And there's almost like a history of kind of a deliberate occupancy of spaces that perhaps didn't conventionally feel accessible to those people. So I'm thinking about John Z.D. setting up Breaking Convention in Sadler's Wells, and we talk about that on the podcast as well. Just really great examples of where people have kind of thought about their class experience and their identity. We asked deliberately, are there any moments when you don't feel that you can enter a space, or you have felt wobbled or uncomfortable in spaces because of your class heritage, which may be intersectional with other aspects, but of your identity, sorry. And I think there's some really brilliant examples of where people have gone, well, actually, no, I just own it more. I just perform it more. Yeah. Or, you know, I want other people to know that I can be in that space.
That takes courage.
It does, yeah. And but of course, I think...
But it's also courage that comes from, that is inherent in training the body to have courage. Because that's what dancers do all the time, you know, and to hone the skill of standing in front of a room full of people and not falling over or something or whatever it is, and doing it night after night, and working through maybe challenging conditions, and they might be financial challenges, or it could be the challenge of working with injury, or your or the challenge of grappling with the artistic kind of work of whatever it is you are doing. But I think more often than not, all the people we talk to, a lot of them at certain moments have imposter syndrome. And that could be related to their class origins.
You know, I know from my own experience that's the case to me, wear it like a uniform.
Yeah. But I think with all of our guests so far, it really is this moment where they come back into their body, and they know their body, and they trust their body because they work with their body day in, day out, and that allows them to take another step forward, and another, and another, and another.
We should all be dancing.
We should.
And that's why I think it's really important and really valuable, because I think often dancing in terms of sort of knowledge hierarchies is not at the top of a knowledge hierarchy. We put words or numbers at the top of a knowledge hierarchy. Like, so for me, I had like an artistic career before I went into higher education and the academy as such, and that was the real moment where I first began to feel very intensely imposter syndrome. Like, and I suddenly realized I had all this luggage about my own capacity for intelligence, but actually doing my PhD, that was when I felt, no, I have this intelligence, and it's a bodily intelligence that is intelligence. And that's what I want to remind when I worked in the university, our students who often came from predominantly working class backgrounds, that so many students sat in front of me and kind of said the words, "I'm stupid," and it was just like half of my job was saying, "No, you're not, and that's why you're here," and to encourage and mentor and cheerlead, and to say you're not sophisticated, and you're not intelligent, and doing that through dance. I felt very passionate about.
As you were talking, I was flicking through my 25-plus age career at BBC as an arts correspondent. Yes, I am that old. And I was just thinking about some of the brilliant people that I've interviewed, and a lot of them, particularly from underrepresented, they just got on with doing the work. Yeah. They just created the work, and because the work was brilliant, it was found. And for me, the more I listen to this, our wonderful community talk about the challenges, the more I think we just need to kind of find ways of getting on with it. And I think outside of dance, what was a real brilliant example of when that worked was with adolescents, a real gritty working class story on so many levels, which just resonated globally. And I think it says a lot about let the art do the work, as romantic as it sounds, because it does feel, and see, like, I remember, and bless his soul, Jamal Edwards, when he started what he did, just got on with it, because every time he went to other institutions, they would turn him down, he just got on with it, you know, and that's what they do, Stormzy, they just get on with it, they find their voice, and then their audiences find them. And I guess I have a love-hate relationship with social media and the likes of it, but it does, in a way, democratize things a little bit, in that everyone can create their own platforms. But I don't want to sit here and be sad. I just think that we just need to kind of get on with it. Let me frame back to you, Neil, because I know you're in your activist spirit.
Internet is another thing, right? Adolescence, that's the dark side. But the bright side is I grew up with a very small menu. Like, I'm just about millennial. So like, I got the internet, but I didn't grow up with it until I was about, I would have been like 9, 10. And there's an abundance now. We're in the age of abundance. So the menu that people can find, dig out, respond to, yeah, there's bad stuff, but there's amazing stuff. Everything's there. Like, people were looking at James Baldwin. Very first interview I did at a college we piloted out in Hackney in 2011, this young woman come up and talk something about Jimi Hendrix. I didn't discover Jimi Hendrix till I was like 20.
Where you been, mate?
I know. I grew up in Swanley, but yeah. But like, that is a real source of, and we will just do it anyway. And there are new institutions. I'm part of one. You know, we just got on with it. We didn't start with any money. We saw what we really felt needed to be done. We had the conversations with the people we needed to talk to, and we started to organise. And I think that goes for the individual artists as well. We do it anyway. They don't deserve us. But we do it anyway.
You get T-shirts, you don't deserve us, to become
but
part
it
of a
is.
tribe.
You know, it may not be recognised, but it's an innately human thing. And that's a really positive thing. And even after all these years of cuts and dooming and all the bad things and all the statistics that go around and circle, I've watched Circle Back now, you know, and little has changed on that narrow little mainstream industry thing. But all around us, I think there is a flourishing, and I really believe in slow news, which talks to that building of community and trust. I think that there are forces that have been building as these conversations have become more and more regular and more people are starting to understand that I think there is a real groundswell. You don't see it, so I could be making it up.
You'll feel it when it comes,
you feel it.
like a tornado.
I see it in schools. I feel it in schools. I feel it in the way that young people talk to us now about what they want to do. There's a stronger belief now that it's possible. And I think that's because all of us doing all the work that we do, it takes time to seep in, but when it does, it's untouchable and it's very valuable.
As my daddy used to say, persistence overcomes resistance. Well, in the spirit of belonging, should we go to the audience that we can't see? Has anyone got questions? I think there's a roving microphone. There's one whipped up right in the front. Let's start there. Thank you.
Two. Hey, okay. Oh, giving away. I'm an artist. That's what we do. Yeah. First of all, yeah. Big up our BSL baddies over here. Doing the good work. I don't know if this is it where I am or
I can hear you.
Just here. Yeah, we good. Okay, cool. I normally can project, but not today because the lungs are not lunging today. So let me know if you can't hear me. My name's Tolu. I'm from Manchester, and just a bit of context. One of my pet hates is people who started out working class, and it's not all about money, and I get that, but maybe through whatever circumstance they've got into, have made it to a position of leadership and artistic direction, and then come into quite a lot of money, but still have that working class mentality, and they're still I'm still working class. Hello. Still working class, which you can be, but also recognize where you've got to. I believe there might be some people in here with lots of money, which is great. What is your advice for people who have the activist mentality, who've come from grassroots, who've, through whatever reason, even hypothetically, come into a bunch of money? How would you advise each of you?
Give it to the arts. Feed it back in.
Or practically, what is like, someone in here just wins the lotto tomorrow and they're like, whoa, what do I do with this? What would help?
Do you mean like philanthropy and that sort of thing? Or
You
anything?
tell us, I don't know, anything. What does that look like?
I mean, I should say give it to Arts Emergency.
Of course.
So that, give us a cut.
Write your invoice.
But, I think that there's a very practical thing at the root of a lot of the challenges we see, like especially with the sort of charitisation of arts institutions and the professionalisation of the arts, all because of financial scarcity. I see organisations don't take chances on people. So I think that if you were to come into lots of money, especially if you're an artist, it'd be so interesting to be a commissioner, create a platform that would fund, like John Miles Edwards, great, example of that. But that's what I would like to see happen more. Like I run a charity, like I say, we don't operate like one, but I get how that world works. Rich people only give you a little bit. We get crumbs to work with. I think if someone was invested in this issue, creating access for amazing young creators, giving people the funding, the chance to really get some traction, that's what I'd say.
Sahra, what would you do with some of that money if you were a candidate?
I'd
what would be your
pocket it
priority?
for myself. No, I'm joking.
Buy another jumper.
Maybe. Yeah, I think what Neil said is very important. And I think also just having money behind things. I don't believe that all art should make money. I think sometimes you just need space and you need time to sort of experiment, flop, just do weird stuff, and then discover what you like. And I think a lot of people don't have that. And then they skip straight to, okay, I need to start making big money. And it's like, there's an in-between, you can't, not everything has to be a win, and that's okay. So yeah, I'd put money, I don't know, I would call it a flop fund, I don't know, like just to fail a bit as an artist, I think is very important.
I like the idea of a flop fund. You can be so experimental with a flop fund, isn't it? You've got nothing to lose. Give me some of that. Any other questions? Is there one? I think I can see waving in over there. Thank you.
I don't know if this is going to be a question, but it didn't look like anyone
we
else
take
was
comments
putting
as
their
well.
hands up. It's really interesting listening to the whole conversation, and I've really appreciated it. I work in the industry. I work for a venue. I find it really difficult working for a venue because I feel like I can be in that gatekeeping position. And my socioeconomic background means that I do very much qualify as working class. And it was interesting listening to you talk because it's so interesting to talk about class now, in the sense that I know you've touched on things like intersectionality, but I can't remember what I read recently, and there was some really interesting stuff in there about how we define class and how we look at it. And I come from a family that I've always had a lot of cultural enrichment. So in terms of culture and access to culture, because when I was a kid, culture was free. Like going to galleries was free. You could go to the theatre a lot cheaper than you can now. I remember seeing lots of films. I remember being given so many books, and reading. My cultural knowledge and my interaction with the world in that sense is, I'd say, quite sophisticated. And then you don't necessarily associate that with being working class. And I think that that's really hard, because I think that there's a lot of people who will have grown up in a similar situation to me, who aren't in careers that reflect that engagement that they've got. I went and did a degree, I did a master's, I paid the full whack 9k a year, which was horrendous. And I work in a venue, I'm also from Manchester. And I was very lucky in the position that I went into that venue on a 9-hour contract on minimum wage and worked really hard, and someone did champion me, and that's great. But now I feel like I'm in the system, and the system is broken. Because as you've talked about with government, it's people in spaces, cultural spaces, that have desire for greater representation and to give artists money to do fuck all with, essentially. And I want to see what is then created. But there's nothing left. And the arts has been so systematically defunded that it feels like it's just such a bigger conversation. Well, I think it's an important conversation, but it goes so much beyond the people who are in those spaces, which is what really kind of hurts. And I just think that the last thing that I will say, because I've realised now I've just talked, is...
That's fine, it's interesting, it's valuable comment.
I just feel like, you know, art and creation and being true to whatever it is you want to express is ultimately political. And art is the greatest, I believe, catalyst for social change. And so I don't think that it's very surprising that it's been systematically defunded by those in power. Because I don't think that the status quo is into the idea of having a great wealth of inclusive culture for people to access. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, well, nice one.
Thank you, that was extremely valuable. Are there any other comments up there? Anyone got any solutions, any other comments they'd like to share? So we don't all live crying into our sleeves. There's a micro comment over there, thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
And thank you very much. It's great to hear from all of you, your perspectives. I'm working in dance, and I've worked in dance for many years. And I was sitting here listening, and I was thinking about like value and how, you know, throughout working as a dancer and choreographer and maker, and I feel like money has, you know, overtaken everything. Everything, you know, there's this, like, you know, it becomes like this consistent weight or this thing that I have to navigate the entire time, no matter what. And so for me, at this stage, I'm going, well, I have to pick what I think is truly worthy of my time, and that gives me, you know, that really feeds me back. And that energizes me, that does, I mean, I'm at a place that I can do that now. But I know that growing up in my family, there was a real focus already then, like, you know, what, going to dance, going to drama, that's not going to give you anything. It was already about the worth of the monetary thing, right? That's the most important thing, and that's what you need to focus on. And I feel like actually over the years, it's just really escalated. I don't live in London anymore, although I grew up here. And I feel like when I come back, I'm always a bit stunned by the contrast of some areas having just flown into like these posh, you know, like really developed places, and then other places that are completely the opposite. And I don't know if you notice it, the people that live here day to day, but I feel like I notice it a lot because I'm not often here anymore. So I suppose, I don't know if there's a question in there, but it's something around value and where, yeah, how do we deal with that? How do we, yeah, work with how these opposing constancies kind of exist?
That's a really good point to reflect on, because does it feel like, because there is no money, those that can create or make are therefore taking less risks because you can't afford to lose any more money? Are institutions playing safe?
Well, I mean, I can respond to all of these things. I'll respond to you first, just to say there's a very strict academic and governmental definition of working class that's related to what the main breadwinner in your house did for an occupation at 14. But you're right, it's a broad term, and I loved what you said. It was great. It's basically my script everywhere I go. Like, absolutely, culture is politics. And hearing you talk, what comes to mind is the climate crisis and what's happening ecologically. And I'm not an artist. I was an activist and organizer that came into this space 15 years ago or so. And I see the correlations, and there's some really interesting statistics around even like the colors of cars have reduced. Architecture has simplified, and even the lyrics of songs compared to just 15 years ago have less words in them. So there's a literal shrinking of experience and expression going on. So I see all these connecting points. So what you said about the arts not being in isolation, these institutions are just as powerless as many of us individuals. That's true to an extent. And I think that the question of value, therefore, is, well, some things are bigger and better and more important than money, as the Arts Emergency Manifesto states. And when I think about the arts and cultural production and contributing to the culture and its political benefits, its social benefits, its planetary benefits, it's a value way beyond the monetary. But people need money to survive because money is survival. So there's a complicated convergence of issues, I think.
I think what's also really difficult right now, and certainly in the podcast we deliberately chose to speak to a cross-section of 20 artists who came through in the 1980s, the 90s, the 2000s and 2010s to get also a perspective of the cultural and economic and political and educational kind of structures of that time, that they were able to grow their pathway through those particular kind of conditions in each decade. And not only, I think, are the arts really struggling now with a dismantling of funding and education, is that it feels just so much more expensive to be alive now than it did 30 years ago. You know, when I was a jobbing dancer in the early 90s, I was working like crazy. I didn't earn a lot of money at all, but it was cheaper to survive. You know, rents were lower, food was cheaper, transport costs were cheaper. Everything goes up in inflation, but proportionally, it was just a lot more doable to survive as an artist. And I really feel for people whose main practice of earning their living is in art making, because I think it really is super, super challenging right now. And what we chat to with our guests as well, and is a particular, I think, thing for working class artists, is this felt sense and intellectually understood sense of precarity, because a lot of working class people don't have any safety net or financial safety net to fall back on. They don't have parents who can support them, or pay their rent, or support them while they do an internship for free. And I think everyone, even our most mature guests that we've spoken to, even when they've had very successful careers, will never presume that they will be secure or financially secure. And I feel that that's like a real felt sense of the working class condition, that you come from nothing and you've got nothing underpinning you as well.
It also makes me think of another topic that we address on the podcast, and I say this with great trepidation, is levelling up. And we deliberately invite this into the conversation because for some of our guests it can be quite a positive term or idea or concept, and for others it's really quite wholly rejected and problematic. But thinking about the two comments just prior to this and this notion of value, I think the part of the reason that we bring this into the conversation is because that can it feels so much oriented towards economic kind of value and economic contribution to society. And what is massively overlooked is this sense of, it's not just about economic value. It's about, people and absolutely, and cultural capital, and those examples of being kind of having a culturally rich education and upbringing, and that being really important. But how is there space for that in this notion of having a level society where equality can be attributed to cultural value as opposed to economic capital?
Right, thank you for that point. How they say all great things come to an end, and sadly we've just simply run out of time, and we could carry on indeed, because it is a thought-provoking and much more to talk about, I'm sure, in terms of a conversation. But I want you to help me to thank our wonderful panel. And then I'm going to ask our panel to thank you, because you've been amazing. Thank you very much. I think we can sum up that there are challenges, but the opportunities are there, and we're all in this together. Enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you very much. And thank you to Dance Umbrella and Battersea Arts Centre.